welcome to Connect Groups. Let's just dive right in. So this week I want to do something a little bit different. Is I'm going to go off of something that I didn't teach at all on Sunday, but I want to go into a deeper principle. I want to talk about this tension that happens in our minds between what was Old Testament law versus New Testament grace. And that's kind of the terminology that a lot of people use. See, if you don't know the argument, let me just kind of introduce it to you. When God delivered the Israelites out of captivity and he introduced himself to them, he gave them his laws. So this was what was oftentimes referred to as the Mosaic law. So God gave his laws to them, and there were 613 total laws that he gave to them. And this was something that they lived out. So when they broke one of those laws, a part of that, the law or the legal system, was a way to be put back in right relationship with God. So even a part of the laws was what sacrifices to make in case they broke the law. And it's just, in my mind, is a remarkable example of God's grace that even within his law, he gave a way to be restored when he broke the law. Okay, so there were 613 laws, and this is what they governed their lives around in their relationship with God. But then when Jesus came, Jesus perfectly lived out the laws, so he never broke any of them. The 613, he did not break a single one of them, so he was perfect in every way, which allowed him that when he sacrificed his life for the sins of the people, he was the spotless lamb, the spotless sacrifice to cover all of their sins, so he was able to redeem back humanity. Anyone that would put their faith in him and receive that grace, his work was good enough or completed that work in them. So Jesus died on the cross, was resurrected, conquering sin and death. Okay, so this is where the tension starts to happen then, how we relate to God has changed. We don't relate to God through laws, we relate to God through the work of what Jesus did on the cross. And so this has created some tension of how do we still respond then to the law, the 613 commands versus how we respond to God through Jesus. So there's a couple of passages. I'll just put these on the screen behind me. In Romans 6:14 it says, "For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace." And this is a concept you'll see multiple times in the New Testament. We're no longer under the law. So we're no longer submissive to the law, but instead to grace. Here's another one that says it, I think, even more clearly, and that is Galatians 3:23 and following. It says, "Now before faith came," and that's what we're talking about with Jesus and the work of what he did on the cross. "Now before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed." And the reason it says imprisoned is that we could never live up to the law, and so it was just like a prison for us. "So then, the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian," or another way to word it, we are no longer under the law. So a lot of people are like, there we have it, right there. Okay, so we no longer have to obey the law, we're not under the law, we're under grace. And so in their minds, all of the laws are no longer relevant to our lives. And so whenever there's an Old Testament principle, people think, well, I don't have to live up to that anymore because that was under the law. But here's where the tension is. Here's what Jesus said. This is in Matthew 5:17, and I'm going to read on. I just put the first couple of verses on the screen. It says, this is Jesus, okay, an actual quote from him. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." And then he goes on and says, "Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So wow, here's a tension. Paul says we're no longer under the law. Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish the law. You have to obey the law. You still have to do the law. And so there's this tension here. So how do you resolve this tension? Is it that we're no longer under the law and that we're completely under grace? Or is it that we're not really under grace, we're still under the law? Well, here's what we have to understand. When it talks about us not being under the law, it's not talking about that none of the laws still apply to our lives. What it's dealing with is that we are no longer saved by operating in the law. You see, what happens is when Jesus died on the cross, he provided another way, a perfect way for us to approach the Father based on what his sacrifice was on the cross. So Jesus died on the cross as the perfect sacrifice for our sins, and all we have to do is put our faith in him in order to have access to the Father and receive that grace so that we can be in right relationship with him. So what has changed is not simply that we're no longer under the law. What's changed is how we actually interact with the Father, how we go to God, and how we find righteousness or right standing with God. Because here's what it says in Romans chapter 2. It says, for those that are outside the law, they're still condemned under the law, and those that are under the law are judged by the law. What it's saying is, it's really in essence saying, Romans 3:23, that all have sinned, all have fallen short of the glory of God. So it's not saying if we don't operate under the law, then we're okay, and if we operate under grace, then it's different. It's just saying all of us have sinned, and we all have to be justified freely by the gift that has been given to us through the grace that's found in Jesus Christ. Okay. So, how we approach God is all that has changed. But then we look at the laws and we go, but does that mean we have to obey all the laws? Because there's 613 of them, and let's just be honest, some of them are weird. I mean, some of the laws are like, if your oxen gorges someone else's bull, you have to do this and that. And if you dig a hole and someone else's animal falls out in that hole, you have to help them get the animal out. And I mean, there's just some weird ones. There's some like, don't plant these two crops next to each other and don't mix these two fabrics. And I would say almost all of our fabrics, all the clothes we wear are a mixture of fabrics. And so there seems to be a little bit of weirdness in this. So let me explain how we process this throughout history. The Jewish people did this, and now Christian theologians do this. What we have to understand is that there are three categories of the law that we have divided. This isn't necessarily explained in Scripture, but there are three categories of the law. Here's the first one. It's the civic law. Now, to give you a little bit of context, the nation of Israel spent over 400 years in slavery, which means they were never a nation. So they never learned how to create systems to govern them as a nation. Just practical things of how to lead and how to handle property disputes, and because they were always under someone else's rule. So God gave them the civic law, some call it the judiciary law, but God gave them some boundaries to create an operating culture within them. He gave them rules to actually create a theocracy where he would be the leader, but he gave them some civic laws, just because they never had this before. But then there were also their ceremonial laws. The ceremonial laws were laws that shaped how they worshiped God. So these laws were given to them operating or teaching them how to operate in the context of the tabernacle and then the temple, of how to approach God in worship. These were very much things that pointed toward Jesus. They were very much dealt with purification if they became impure, how they could do these rituals to become purified so that they could approach God in the temple and approach him with sacrifices. But all of this had to do with how they approached God in worship. And then lastly, there were the moral laws. And the moral laws were laws given by God to the people of how to shape their hearts in relationship to him. So these were the 10 Commandments. All of them were moral laws. And so there were these three different types of laws. So when Jesus came and he died on the cross, perfecting the law, living it out, died, was resurrected, putting us in right standing with God, all of these three types of laws changed in how we now relate to them. Let me explain. So the civic laws that were given to govern a nation, when Jesus died on the cross, at that point forward, the message of the cross was no longer for a specific race of people, the Israelites. It was now available to every tongue and tribe in the entire world. So those passages were no longer relevant because every nation was different and operated in different ways and had different systems. So those had a time, but Jesus' work on the cross changed it so that it was now for every nation, no longer just the Israelites. So those laws were no longer relevant to us. Then there's the ceremonial laws. The ceremonial laws were shaped how we worship God and how we approach him in sacrifices and purification. But Jesus' work on the cross was the perfect sacrifice, fulfilling every single one of the ceremonial laws. So they were not abolished or done away with. They were fulfilled perfectly in Jesus Christ. So there's no need to make a sacrifice anymore. Jesus was the perfect sacrifice. There's no need to do certain types of washing because we're washed by the blood of the Lamb. Everything was fulfilled perfectly in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But then this leaves us with the last group of laws, the moral laws. Now, Jesus honored them perfectly, but here's the question. The moral laws were given to shape our heart in relationship to God. So when you look at the 10 Commandments, don't have any other God before me. Is that still in effect? Yes, because it's shaping our heart and how we approach God. Honoring father and mother, it's shaping our hearts into authority of how we approach God. Do not kill. Jesus took it further and said, do not even be angry at someone, because again, he's shaping our heart in how we approach God. The moral laws are still in effect because they were given to shape our hearts in how we approach God. So the reason that we're looking at this in this context is as we look at tithing. Is tithing a part of the moral law? And that's the question we have to wrestle with. So let me say some statements and see if this stirs anything in your mind and heart. It was given, tithing was given so that we could give our hearts to God. Okay? Tithing was given to break the hold money has on our lives. Tithing was given so that we can learn to trust God. Tithing was given so that we can see that God is trustworthy. So here's the question. Is this still in effect? Is tithing still a part of the moral law of God? And I would clearly say yes. It was given as a gift. It was not given to restrict us. It was given as a gift from God to us as a way for us to give our hearts back to him. And this is why we teach that tithing is still in effect today. It is one of the most generous gifts God has ever given us so that we can give our hearts to him. Hope you have a great discussion as you talk about the issue of tithing and what we talked about in this video. I love you guys. See you this weekend.